In the last video, we left off by looking at valence electrons. Now, reminder, valence electrons are the number of electrons in the outermost shell of an atom. If an atom only has one valence electron shell, like hydrogen and helium, the full number, the complete number for a first shell is 2 electrons. So hydrogen has an incomplete valence electron shell because it only has 1 electron, whereas helium has a complete valence electron shell because it has 2 electrons in its outermost shell. All of the other atoms have other shells on the outside of that initial shell, and the outer shells can hold up to 8 electrons. So for example, lithium has 1 valence electron, so its outer electron shell is incomplete. If we look at neon instead, neon has 8 electrons, 8 valence electrons in its outermost shell, so we say it is complete or it is stable. Now, all of the atoms that do not have complete valence electron shells, we say they are unstable, and they will either share or transfer electrons to each other in order to complete and to become fulfilled so that their valence electron shells are filled. When they are either sharing electrons or transferring electrons, this results in interactions between atoms and attractions between atoms, and we call these things chemical bonds. We are going to take a look at 2 different types of chemical bonds, covalent bonding and ionic bonding. Now, for an example, hydrogen, as you saw on those previous slides, has 1 valence electron. So this hydrogen atom over here has 1 valence. This hydrogen atom over here has 1 valence. In order to become complete, each hydrogen atom, quote unquote, prefers to have 2 valence electrons in their outermost shells. So what hydrogen will do, 2 hydrogen atoms will interact with each other and share those 2 electrons in between the 2, so now they each have 2 electrons in their outermost shells. We now say that they are stable, and they are resulting in a chemical bond called a covalent bond because the electrons are being shared between those 2 atoms. Now, we can designate these types of chemical bonds different ways. This example back here is more of a structural diagram here, how it's actually occurring. Usually you won't see it drawn like that. If we see the abbreviation, so H and H, connected with a line, that usually indicates a bond. That's a structural formula. The molecular formula is written with numbers. So there are 2 hydrogen atoms in this particular molecule, so we would write it H2. Some other ways that you might see it: electron distribution diagram. You may have done some of those in chemistry, very similar to the Lewis dot structure that shows how many valence electrons are around each atom. And then the space filling model. This is what we actually believe these atoms and molecules look like in 3-dimensional space. Now, in covalent bonds, sometimes those atoms will share their electrons equally, and sometimes atoms will not share electrons equally. And this all depends on an atom's electronegativity. This is the attraction that an atom has for electrons in that shared covalent bond. For example, between hydrogen and hydrogen, because they are the same element, they are going to have very similar pools, very similar electronegativities. So these electrons that are here between the 2 hydrogen are going to be pooled on or shared pretty equally. We call this type of covalent bond a non-polar covalent bond because the atoms are sharing those electrons equally. Think of 2 very similar sized people pulling on a tug of war rope. They're going to be pulling on it with pretty equal strength. Now, a polar covalent bond, on the other hand, typically has 1 or more atoms that are very, very electronegative, sharing electrons with other atoms that are not very electronegative. So we call this unequal sharing. For example, we're going to spend lots of time looking at water. Oxygen is a very, very electronegative atom, whereas hydrogen are pretty small electronegativities. So oxygen has a higher affinity for electrons and will pull those electrons closer to itself. The electrons are not being shared equally between the atoms in this molecule. So let's pretend that we have these electrons here and we have them being shared here, because oxygen is pulling them more towards itself, electrons do have negative charges, so the top of the atom or the top of the molecule will have a partial negative charge because those negatively charged particles are being pulled more towards the top. Additionally, because those electrons are kind of being pulled away from this end of the molecule, this end of the molecule gets a partial positive charge because it's kind of losing those electrons a little bit. This type of molecule, we call it polar because it has different areas of charge on it. Or we could say that the bond that's holding those atoms together is a polar covalent bond. We are going to spend a lot of time looking at water and other types of polar molecules because they are very, very important to happenings in biology. Now, whether we're talking about a polar covalent bond or a nonpolar covalent bond, they are both similar in that they are both types of covalent bonds. We have atoms sharing electrons between them. That's our first main type of bond that we're going to study. It is the strongest type of bond, and our second type of bond that we're going to take a look at is an ionic bond. So covalent, sharing, ionic, think stealing. One atom is usually so electronegative, so much more electronegative than the other atom, that it strips or steals electrons from the second atom. This transfer of electrons usually results in the atoms having charges on them. We call these ions then. Let's take a look at an example with sodium and chlorine. Now, sodium has 1 valence electron. Chlorine has 7 valence electrons. Chlorine will steal sodium's electrons, so the electron gets moved to chlorine. And because that extra electron is transferred to chlorine, chlorine now has an extra negatively charged particle, so the entire chlorine atom has a negative charge associated with it. Sodium, because it has lost a negative charge, it has lost an electron, it now has a positive charge associated with it. Negatively charged ions are called anions, and positively charged ions are called cations. And as you know, things that are oppositely charged will attract. So this positive and this negatively charged atom will attract to each other, and that is what an ionic bond is. Now, unlike our covalent bonds, so let me jump back here, where it actually forms a molecule between oxygen and 2 hydrogen, ionic compounds are a little bit different. Notice I said molecule for covalent and compound for ionic, and that is because ionic bonds typically result in these compounds, or what we call salts. Rather than just having 1 sodium and 1 chlorine ion attracting to each other, we typically see lots and lots of sodiums and chlorines forming together to form this type of salt. So ionic bonds result from stealing of electrons, and if we're thinking of this as a scale, covalent is our most strong, ionic bonds are like our next strongest, and then the last two that we're going to take a look at today are what we call weak chemical bonds. Even though these are weak, these are typically pretty important in biology because they reinforce the shapes of molecules like proteins, and they also help molecules stick to each other. So we're going to take a look at 2 different types of weak chemical bonds. The first one we're going to be spending a lot of time on is the hydrogen bond. The hydrogen bond typically results between 2 polar molecules. So let's take a look at 2 polar molecules. We've already investigated water, right? Water is polar because it has partial charges all over it. Another polar molecule is ammonia because nitrogen is another very electronegative atom. So there are charges all over this molecule. Now, even though these are just partial charges, if we have 2 oppositely charged parts of a molecule, or 2 molecules, they will interact with each other. So for example, the hydrogen end of a water molecule has a partial positive charge, and the nitrogen end of an ammonia molecule has a partial negative charge. If these 2 areas come in close contact with each other, they will temporarily stick together. This interaction, this sticking together, is what we call a hydrogen bond. Now, a hydrogen bond is a weak chemical bond because it is not a permanent bond like here between oxygen and hydrogen. Hydrogen bonds typically form, break, reform as these molecules are moving around in space. We will spend much more time looking at hydrogen bonds in Chapter 3 as we investigate water a little bit more closely. So that's our first type of weak chemical bond. Our second type of weak chemical bond is called a van der Waals interaction. These are kind of strange and they kind of are difficult to think about because we typically think about an atom as this set in stone shape where the positive charges are in the center in the nucleus and the negative charges are outside the nucleus in an electron cloud or electron shells. Now, atoms don't hold this shape 24/7 because they are moving in space and all of the particles are moving around. Sometimes the particles end up in hot spots. So for example, let's say all of the electrons of this atom temporarily end up on this side of the atom, and the nucleus of this atom temporarily ends up on this side of the atom. Because we have these hot spots, this side is more negative, this side is more positive, those sides of the atoms kind of have charges associated with them and they will attract to each other. These are called van der Waals interactions. So they're attractions between molecules that are close together resulting from these hot spots of positive or negative charges. They typically, again, can reinforce molecular shape, have molecules stick together or atoms stick together, but this is very weak and is very temporary. Now, the reason we're spending so much time talking about chemistry and biology is because technically biology is chemistry. At the basic level of everything, we're all a bunch of molecules and compounds. And a molecule shape is extremely important to its function. You're going to see that theme over and over and over again in biology. And biological molecules interact with each other based on these shapes. So let's take a look at an example. In the brain, we have endorphin receptors in all of our cell membranes. Natural endorphin is a molecule that looks like this, and when this molecule interacts with this purple receptor, it sets a chain reaction off in the brain that kind of makes us feel this natural euphoria, happiness, and just a general good feeling. Morphine, totally different molecule, has a very, very similar, almost identical shape at this end of the molecule. When morphine, a drug, is introduced into the body, same exact thing happens. It interacts with this receptor, sending off that same exact chain reaction of events. So morphine has the same physiological response or result as natural endorphins. So molecular shape has a lot to do with the effect and how these molecules interact with each other. So again, this is why we are spending so much time talking about chemistry and biology, because it forms the basis of everything that we do. So this kind of concludes Chapter 2. So you saw 2 videos from Chapter 2. If you are confused about anything or needed some extra help, please let me know. You can always email me. Thanks, guys.